There are moments in history that split time in two, moments where everything before them feels almost innocent, and everything after them carries a shadow that never fully lifts. The story of Jeffrey Epstein is one of those moments. And yet, as monstrous as the real story is, and it is monstrous, documented, court-verified, and devastating, something strange happened alongside it. Something that reveals just as much about us, about human psychology, about fear, and the desperate need to make sense of evil, as it does about the man himself. The moment news broke that Jeffrey Epstein had died in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York on August 10th, 2019, the internet did not grieve. It did not pause. It did not wait. Within minutes, not hours, not days, minutes, social media exploded, not with mourning, not even with simple outrage, but with a tidal wave of speculation, theory, accusation, and mythology so elaborate, so intricately woven, so dramatic that almost rivaled the real story in sheer cinematic scope. Epstein didn't kill himself. You've seen it. You probably said it, or at least thought it. That phrase became one of the most repeated sentences of the entire decade. It showed up on beer cans, on memes, on T-shirts, on protest signs. It was spray-painted on walls. It was murmured by news anchors who technically weren't allowed to say it. It became a kind of cultural shorthand, a way of nodding at the idea that something was rotten, something was covered up, something was deeply, catastrophically wrong at the highest levels of power. And here's the thing. Some of those instincts weren't wrong. There were real questions. There were real failures. There were real documented lapses, guards who fell asleep, cameras that malfunctioned, a man who had supposedly attempted suicide weeks earlier left alone in his cell. These were not invented concerns. These were legitimate, infuriating, documented failures of an institution and a system that many people had every reason not to trust. But something else happened alongside the legitimate questions. Something darker, stranger, and more dangerous. The real story, the documented abuse of hundreds of young girls, the trafficking network, the powerful men who participated, the institutional failures that allowed it all to go on for decades. That story began to get swallowed, absorbed, consumed, distorted beyond recognition by a conspiracy mythology so sprawling, so all-encompassing, so absolutely bonkers in its most extreme corners that it started doing something terrible. It started protecting the very people it claimed to be exposing. Because when you tell someone that Jeffrey Epstein was the head of a satanic death cult that ritually sacrificed children to summon interdimensional beings, or that he was running a blackmail operation for Mossad, or that he was a time-traveling agent of a secret cabal of lizard people, when you say things like that with the same breath that you say the names of real, actual perpetrators and real, actual victims, you do something catastrophically destructive, you make the whole thing sound insane. You discredit the real survivors. You hand the guilty a shield made entirely of the world's eye rolls. That's what this video is about. Not protecting Jeffrey Epstein. Not defending the powerful people whose names appear in documented flight logs and court testimonies. Not pretending the justice system handled this well. Not pretending the institutions involved have clean hands. This video is about something both simpler and more complicated than all that. It is about the truth, the full, documented, painful, infuriating, real truth. And why that truth, as dark as it is being buried under an avalanche of mythology that serves the guilty far more than it serves the victims. We're going to go through it all. The life of Jeffrey Epstein, from his strange origins to his extraordinary rise to power, the documented crimes, the real victims, the real failures, the first arrest, the infamous plea deal, the second arrest, the death, and everything strange about it, the named individuals, the court documents, the verified facts, and then, section by section, claim by claim, we are going to pull apart the Satanic co-conspiracy theory, the child sacrifice mythology, the interdimensional theories, the QAnon pipeline that weaponized all of this. We're going to look at where it came from, who spreads it, who benefits from it, and why it is, in the most precise sense, a lie dressed up in the costume of truth. Stay with me, because the real story is dark enough, and it deserves to be told cleanly. Before we talk about the conspiracy theories, before we tear apart the mythology, before we get to the satanic ritual claims and the underground temple and all the rest of it, we have to talk about the man, the actual man. Because one of the most insidious things the conspiracy theories do is replace the real Jeffrey Epstein, a genuinely terrifying, genuinely predatory, genuinely incomprehensible figure, with a fictional supervillain so cartoonish that he almost becomes unbelievable. And once he becomes unbelievable, so do his victims. Jeffrey Edward Epstein was born on January 20th, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York. His family was working class. His father worked for the New York City Parks Department. There was nothing in his early life that screamed future billionaire. Nothing in his childhood that screamed future sex trafficker of children. He was smart, apparently very smart. He tested into a gifted program. He was interested in mathematics. He had a kind of charm that people who knew him then described as remarkable, the ability to make you feel like the most interesting person in the room, while simultaneously making you feel like he was even more interesting. He attended Lafayette High School and then later took classes at Cooper Union and New York University. But here is something important. He never actually graduated. He dropped out. And yet, at 21 years old, he walked into a job interview at the Dalton School, one of New York City's most elite private schools, and somehow, without a degree, talked his way into teaching mathematics and physics. This is one of the earliest signs of who Epstein actually was. A man whose ability to present himself, to perform intelligence and authority, to make people believe things about him that weren't true, was almost supernatural in its effectiveness. He taught at Dalton for a few years, and it was there, through the social connections that came with teaching the children of Manhattan's elite, that he started climbing. A parent of one of his students, Alan Greenberg, the chairman of Bear Stearns, one of Wall Street's most powerful firms, took a liking to him. By 1976, Epstein had left teaching and joined Bear Stearns as a junior options trader. Within a few years, he was a limited partner. He was 25 years old. Now, here's where things start getting genuinely murky, and this is real murkiness, documented murkiness, not conspiracy theory murkiness. By 1981, Epstein left Bear Stearns. The exact circumstances of his departure have never been fully clarified. There were rumors of violations of SEC regulations. Nothing was proven. Nothing was charged. He just left, and then, with no real explanation, he seemed to essentially invent a new identity. He founded a financial management firm called J. Epstein and Company, which he later renamed the Financial Trust Company, and relocated to the U.S. Virgin Islands, a decision that, as we'll see, had very significant legal implications. He claimed to manage the finances of billionaires. Specifically, He claimed he only worked with clients who had at least $1 billion in assets. Enormous, almost unverifiable wealth for a man with no college degree, no clear business history, and no traceable source of income. Here's the thing that should have made people ask questions decades earlier. Nobody can ever quite explain where Epstein's money came from. Real wealth managers have clients who are publicly known. They manage funds that are audited, tracked, regulated. Epstein's operation was almost entirely opaque. His one-name verified major client was Leslie Wexner, the billionaire founder of L Brands, which includes Victoria's Secret. Wexner gave Epstein an extraordinary level of access to his finances. Epstein manages money, his real estate, his corporate affairs. And in 1989, Wexner transferred to Epstein the ownership of a Manhattan mansion that would become one of the most famous and sinister addresses in America. 9 East 71st Street, a 9-story townhouse on the Upper East Side, the largest private residence in Manhattan. How does a man with a murky financial past, no verifiable client list, no degree, and no clearly explained source of income end up in a 9-story Manhattan mansion, a private island in the Caribbean, a ranch in New Mexico, apartments in Paris and London, and a private Boeing 727 jet? This is the real question. And the real answer, is not Satanism. It is not lizard people. It is not an ancient blood cult. It is something much more prosaic and much more damning. A system of connections, favors, wealth, and protection that operates in plain sight, built on decades of elite networking and, as would eventually be documented in court, a meticulous operation of sexual exploitation and blackmail. The real Jeffrey Epstein was a con man, a predator, a networker of extraordinary skill, a man who understood that power, once accumulated, insulates itself. He did not need to be supernatural. He did not need to be the head of a satanic death cult. He needed only to be what he was: brilliant in his manipulation, relentless in his accumulation of leverage, and absolutely embedded in a world where wealth buys silence. That's who Jeffrey Epstein was. And the real story of what he did is devastating enough without adding a single ritual or a single candle. Let's talk about the network, because this is where things get genuinely complicated, genuinely infuriating, and genuinely important, and also where the conspiracy theories do the most damage, because there's a real network. There are real names. There are real documented court-verified connections between Jeffrey Epstein and some of the most powerful people on earth. And those connections deserve to be talked about clearly, carefully, and accurately, not inflated, not distorted, not connected to bloodlines or occult rituals, just stated plainly with evidence and with the seriousness they deserve. Let's start with what we know from documents. The most significant set of documents in the Epstein case, the ones that sent the internet into its most recent frenzy, came from a civil lawsuit filed by Virginia Giuffre, one of Epstein's most prominent survivors. Giuffre sued Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's longtime companion, an alleged primary recruiter and handler of young girls. In the course of that litigation, a vast archive of deposition material, correspondence, and witness testimony was accumulated. When portions of those documents were unsealed by a federal judge in 2024, they contained names, lots of names. Among the names that appeared in various capacities in the documents: Prince Andrew, Duke of York, who was already publicly identified and had been forced to publicly deny Virginia Giuffre's allegations that he had sex with her when she was 17. Bill Clinton, whose name appeared in flight logs, showing it flown on Epstein's private jet on multiple occasions. Donald Trump also appeared in flight logs, also had a documented social relationship with Epstein going back to the 1980s. Also was quoted in a 2002 New York Magazine article calling Epstein a terrific guy who likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side. Alan Dershowitz, Harvard law professor and high-profile defense attorney, who was named in Giuffre's lawsuit as one of the men she was allegedly trafficked to. There were others, politicians, businessmen, academics, royalty. The flight logs are Epstein's private jet, nicknamed the Lolita Express by the New York Post, showed a staggering list of prominent travelers. The documented guest registers from Little St. James, his private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, revealed more. Now, here is where precision matters enormously. Let's be absolutely clear about something. Appearing in a flight log does not mean you participated in the abuse of minors. Being listed in a deposition as someone a witness met does not constitute a conviction or even a charge. The documented connections range enormously in severity, from people who merely attended parties with Epstein and had no knowledge of or involvement in his crimes, all the way to people who were directly accused by survivors of participation in abuse. These are not the same thing, and treating them as if there is not justice. It is chaos, and chaos, as we will see, protects the guilty. What is unambiguous from the documented evidence is this. Jeffrey Epstein used his social connections, his wealth, his properties, and his network of associates, most prominently Ghislaine Maxwell, to recruit, groom, and sexually abuse and traffic young girls, many of them minors. The abuse occurred at multiple locations: the Manhattan Mansion, the Palm Beach Estate, the New Mexico Ranch, and on Little St. James. Hundreds of women came forward. Some were abused beginning as young as 13 or 14 years old. They were offered money, gifts, and opportunities. They were manipulated by older girls who had themselves been victimized and were then weaponized to recruit others. They were abused, degraded, and in many cases threatened into silence. This is real. This is documented. This is the network. It is not a secret society. It is not a millennial-old blood cult. It is a predatory operation run by a very wealthy, very connected man who understood that his wealth and his connections created a near impenetrable shield of protection. And for decades, that shield worked. Understanding the real network matters not just for justice, but because the conspiracy theories that have attached themselves to this case have very deliberately blurred the distinction between real documented complicity and fictional invented complicity. When you mix the names of real participants with the names of fictional characters in a made-up satanic ritual, you make it very hard for juries and the public to know who actually did what. That serves no one but the guilty. The year is 2005. The Palm Beach Police Department begins receiving complaints. A 14-year-old girl, then another. Young girls from troubled backgrounds, recruited at local shopping malls and schools with offers of money, initially just massages, then escalating through manipulation and coercion into sexual abuse. The complaints are credible. They are specific. They are corroborated by multiple witnesses. The Palm Beach police conduct an investigation. They build a case. By 2006, the case has been referred to the FBI and to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida. The federal investigation expands enormously. Dozens of victims are identified. The potential charges are serious: sex trafficking of minors, conspiracy, exploitation of children. This was not a close call. This was not a difficult case. This was, by the accounts of the investigators who worked it, a solid, slam-dunk prosecution waiting to happen. And then it didn't. What happened instead became one of the most notorious abuses of prosecutorial discretion in American legal history. Alex Acosta, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida at the time, negotiated a deal with Epstein's defense team that was so extraordinarily lenient, so jaw-droppingly favorable to Epstein, that when it finally became public knowledge over a decade later, it prompted congressional hearings, destroyed a cabinet career, and sparked a national conversation about how the rich and powerful escape accountability in the American justice system. The deal, officially known as a non-prosecution agreement, was reached in 2007 and signed in 2008. Under its terms, Jeffrey Epstein pleaded guilty to 2 state charges: solicitation prostitution and solicitation of a minor. Let's pause on that framing for a moment. Solicitation of prostitution. The language frames the victims, many of them children, as prostitutes, as willing participants in a commercial transaction. The language is itself a violence. He was sentenced to 18 months in a Palm Beach County jail, not a federal prison, a county jail, of which he would serve 13 months. But the deal got worse, far worse. The non-prosecution agreement also extended immunity from federal prosecution to any potential co-conspirators who might otherwise have been charged. This is the part that has never been satisfactorily explained. Why were people who were not yet named in the prosecution given blanket immunity as part of a deal that hadn't even gone to trial? Who were those co-conspirators? Why were they protected? And then there was the matter of how Epstein served his time. Under a work release program that was later found to have been improperly granted, Epstein was allowed to leave the county jail 6 days a week, for up to 12 hours a day, to go to his Palm Beach office. He was on work release. He was functionally under almost no restriction. He served his sentence the way you and I serve a shift at the office. Crucially, and this is both real and critically important, the non-prosecution agreement was negotiated in secret without notifying the victims. This was later found to be a violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act in a ruling by a federal judge. The victims were robbed not only of their childhoods, not only of justice, but even of the basic knowledge that a deal was being made in their name. When Acosta later tried to explain the deal in 2019, when it had become a massive public scandal, he said, reportedly, that he had been told to back off, that Epstein belonged to intelligence. This quote, unverified, reported secondhand, immediately became one of the central pillars of conspiracy theories, because if true, it suggests Epstein had a handler, a protector, an intelligence agency connection that made him untouchable. And that is genuinely worth taking seriously as a line of inquiry. But taking it seriously means investigating it, sourcing it, demanding documentation, not building a 40-story mythology on top of a single reported quote. The plea deal is real. The injustice is real. The unanswered questions are real. But reality, as we'll see, has a way of being stranger and more damning than even the darkest fiction. Let's talk about the island, because it has become possibly the single most mythologized location in the entire Epstein conspiracy universe. Little St. James, sometimes called Pedophile Island by those who knew what was happening there. a private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, roughly 75 acres, purchased by Epstein in 1998 for roughly $7.5 million and transformed over the following years into something that looked, from satellite images, like nothing so much as a private resort built for one man and his guests. There were residences, goose houses, a marina, staff quarters, an amphitheater, carefully manicured grounds, and most dramatically, a distinctive structure that sits at the top of the island's highest point, a small building with blue and white stripes and a golden dome, flanked by what appear to be owl statues. When images of this structure circulated widely on social media, and they did circulate endlessly, the conspiracy theory machine roared to life instantly. The structure was, the theories claimed, a temple, specifically a satanic temple, a place where children were ritually sacrificed, where blood was drained, where satanic rites were performed by hooded figures drawn from the ranks of the global elite, where the harvesting of adrenochrome, a supposed mystical compound derived from the blood of terrified children that allegedly granted immortality to those who consumed it, took place on an altar. The building, the theory said, was built precisely for this purpose. The underground tunnels beneath the island were where the children were kept. The dome was where they were sacrificed. The owls were a symbol of Moloch, the ancient Canaanite deity worshipped through child sacrifice. Let's take this apart piece by piece, because every single element of this theory is either factually wrong, grossly distorted, or entirely invented. The building is real. The blue and white stripes are real. The golden dome is real. But what is it actually? Aerial photographs taken over multiple years, architectural analysis, and testimony from people who worked on the island all point to the same answer. It was a music pavilion, a performance space. It was where Epstein hosted musical performances and entertainment for his guests. The blue and white color scheme? Epstein had a documented preference for that particular aesthetic. It's the same color scheme used on other structures on the island, and echoes the colors of the Israeli flag, which various corners of the internet turned into its own sub-theory. The golden dome is consistent with decorative elements Epstein favored across his properties. The owl statues? Yes, they exist. Owls appear in various esoteric and historical contexts, including as a symbol associated with Bohemian Grove, a real and genuinely strange gathering of powerful men in California that has its own documented history. But owls are also simply decorative. Epstein liked owls. They appear at his other properties too. An owl statue is not evidence of Moloch worship any more than a garden gnome is evidence of elf worship. And the underground tunnels? Here is where mythology becomes particularly perverse. There are documented underground storage areas on Little St. James, utility tunnels, infrastructure. Construction workers who worked on the island have been interviewed and described them. They are storage tunnels, utility corridors, the kind of thing found under almost any large private compound anywhere in the world. There is no evidence, none documented, of anything else beneath that island. Now, here's the darkest, most important thing about the island mythology. The real horrors that took place on Little St. James do not require a temple. They do not require blood rituals or underground sacrifice chambers. Survivors have described, in court documents, in police reports, in published testimonies, what actually happened on that island. Young girls were brought there. They were abused by Epstein and by others. They were isolated, vulnerable, far from home, surrounded by water. They were exploited in the most devastating and ordinary human way. by a powerful man who understood that his money and his island and his connections made him untouchable. That is a horror of Little St. James. It is not a satanic temple. It is a playground for a predator who was never stopped because no one in a position to stop him had the will or the courage to do so. The real story is worse than the fantasy because it requires no supernatural evil. It requires only the very human capacity for cruelty, cowardice, and complicity. If Jeffrey Epstein was the architect of the operation, Ghislaine Maxwell was its most critical component. And in many ways, her story is the story of the conspiracy theories too, because she existed at the intersection of the real and mythologized, the documented and the invented, in ways that make her one of the most genuinely chilling figures in the entire saga. Ghislaine Noel Marion Maxwell was born in 1961 in Maisons-Laffitte, France, the ninth and youngest child of Robert Maxwell, a British media baron of extraordinary wealth and reputation, and of extraordinary corruption. Robert Maxwell's story is itself almost novelistic in its scope. A Holocaust survivor from a Czechoslovakian Jewish family, he built a publishing empire, served as a member of parliament, cultivated connections across the global political spectrum from Margaret Thatcher to Mikhail Gorbachev, and died in 1991 under extremely mysterious circumstances. His body found floating in the Atlantic Ocean near his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine. His death was ruled accidental drowning, though conspiracy theories have always swirled around it. After his death, it was revealed that he had looted hundreds of millions of pounds from his employees' pension funds. Ghislaine grew up in extraordinary privilege in the shadow of an enormous, domineering father. When Robert Maxwell died and his estate collapsed into scandal and debt, Ghislaine lost everything. She moved to New York, and she found Jeffrey Epstein. Their relationship has never been fully characterized to anyone's satisfaction. Were they lovers, business partners, co-conspirators? Epstein once described Maxwell as his best friend. She described herself as Epstein's social director. Survivors describe her as his most active recruiter, the person who approached young girls, who groomed them, who introduced them to Epstein, and who in some cases directly participated in their abuse. At the same time, Ghislaine Maxwell occupied a unique social position. She was not a mysterious backroom figure. She was visible, glamorous, present. She appeared at parties. She was photographed at celebrity events. She was friends, documented, photographed, publicly friends, with royalty, with politicians, with Hollywood figures. The famous photograph of her sitting next to Prince Andrew at a party, taken years after the abuse was already underway, is a document of her social reach. A photograph taken at a birthday party for the comedian Dave Chappelle showed her seated near Kevin Spacey. She was at public events, in public spaces, in plain sight. This is one of the most disturbing things about the Epstein operation. It was not hidden in the underground tunnels of a satanic temple. It was partially hidden, but also partially in plain sight. Powerful people knew something was off. Some knew exactly what was happening. The social shield was real, and was made not of occult protection, but a very ordinary human desire to not ask questions of wealthy, powerful, well-connected people. In 2020, Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested. In December 2021, she was convicted on 5 counts of sex trafficking and other charges. She was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. She continues to appeal. She has never, despite enormous pressure and enormous legal incentive, named names in any comprehensive way. Her silence, or her calculated management of what she chooses to say, remains one of the most infuriating aspects of the entire case. The conspiracy theories around Maxwell are layered. Some claim she is an Israeli intelligence asset, citing her father's documented connections to Israeli intelligence. Some claim she has been replaced with a body double in prison. Some claim she was a true mastermind and Epstein was merely a front. Some of these theories have a kernel of documented fact at their root. Her father's intelligence connections are real, but they bloom into elaborate fictions that serve ultimately to obscure the human reality of what she did and why. What she actually did was devastating enough. She was a woman who had been shaped by enormous privilege and paternal dysfunction into someone capable of using her social skills and her class status to make children trust her before facilitating their exploitation. That is the documented reality of Ghislaine Maxwell. It is not the stuff of ancient cults or supernatural protection. It is the stuff of human beings at their worst. By the summer of 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was living what appeared to be a remarkably comfortable life for a registered sex offender. He was still managing his financial operation from his various properties. He still flew on his private jet. He still maintained his Manhattan mansion and his island. The plea deal from 2008 had given him a second chance that he treated with complete contempt. There were credible reports that the abuse had never stopped, that young women were still being brought to his properties, that the operation that the 2008 deal was supposed to end had simply continued. On July 6, 2019, Epstein returned to the United States on his private jet from Paris. Federal agents were waiting for him at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. He was arrested on federal charges of sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking. The charges have been filed by prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, a different office from the one that had made the 2008 deal. SDNY, as it's known, had a reputation for independence and prosecutorial aggressiveness. These charges were not going to disappear into a non-prosecution agreement. The indictment described decades of abuse. It referenced the Palm Beach estate and the New York mansion specifically. It alleged that Epstein had abused dozens of victims, some as young as 14. It alleged that he and others created a network of recruiters who found vulnerable young girls, and that Epstein and his associates knew the girls were minors. Epstein pleaded not guilty and was denied bail after prosecutors argued he was a flight risk. He owned a private jet and had no strong ties to keep him in the country. He was sent to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan, a federal detention facility. And there, on the morning of August 10th, 2019, he was found dead in his cell. The official cause of death, determined by the New York City Medical Examiner, was suicide by hanging. But from the very first moment the news broke, that conclusion was met with widespread disbelief. And not just from conspiracy theorists. From legal experts, from journalists, from former law enforcement, from the victim's own attorneys. The circumstances were genuinely, legitimately strange. Epstein had been found injured in his cell on July 23rd, just a few weeks into his incarceration, in what was reported as a possible prior suicide attempt, though his lawyers disputed this and suggested he may have been attacked by his cellmate. After that incident, he had been placed on suicide watch. On August 9th, he was taken off suicide watch. On the night of August 9th into August 10th, the two guards assigned to watch him both fell asleep, something they later admitted and for which they faced federal charges, though those charges were eventually dropped. The cameras outside his cell malfunctioned and did not record the relevant time period. Every single one of these things happening simultaneously, the removal from suicide watch, the sleeping guards, the malfunctioning cameras, is either an extraordinary coincidence or something else. And the word something else is where the entire mythology lives. Let's be honest about this. The circumstances of Epstein's death are suspicious. The officially acknowledged failures are real. The fact that a man facing potentially life-defining testimony who had spent his entire adult life cultivating connections with the most powerful people in the world died in federal custody under these specific conditions, that is not a ridiculous thing to find suspicious. The forensic pathologist hired by Epstein's brother, Dr. Michael Baden, examined the body and concluded that the physical evidence was more consistent with homicide than suicide. So, was Epstein murdered? It is genuinely possible. It is perhaps even likely, depending on how much weight you give to the forensic analysis versus the official findings. But we do not know, and that uncertainty, honest, real, documented uncertainty, is not the same thing as knowing he was murdered by a satanic cabal of adrenochrome-drinking global elites. One is a justified question. The other is a story. Now we have to talk about where the satanic conspiracy theory actually came from, because it didn't spring fully formed from nowhere. It has a lineage. It has a history. It has specific origins that, once you understand them, tell you a great deal about who builds these narratives and why. To understand the satanic Epstein mythology, you have to go back much further than 2019. You have to go back to the 1980s and a period in American history that we now call the Satanic Panic. The Satanic Panic was a period of widespread moral panic that swept across the United States and parts of Western Europe in the 1980s and into the early 1990s. It was triggered by a combination of factors: the emergence of evangelical Christian anxiety about occult influence in popular culture, a misapplication of the newly developed therapeutic techniques around recovered memories of childhood trauma, and a media environment that was both credulous about and addicted to sensational stories. The panic manifested most dramatically in a series of criminal prosecutions of daycare workers and nursery school teachers accused of participating in satanic ritual abuse of children in their care. The most famous of these cases was the McMartin preschool case in Manhattan Beach, California, which resulted in the longest and most expensive criminal trial in American history at the time. The McMartin defendants were accused of sexually abusing hundreds of children in underground tunnels beneath the preschool, of performing blood rituals, of flying on broomsticks, of sacrificing animals. The children, interviewed under a flawed methodology that experts now recognize as highly susceptible to leading questioning, produced accounts that escalated in elaborateness and impossibility over time. Eventually, all charges were dropped. No tunnels were found. Excavations showed nothing. The physical evidence never materialized, but the accusations had already destroyed lives. Multiple defendants spent years in prison before being exonerated or having charges dropped. The therapists who elicited the testimony and the media figures who amplified it faced almost no accountability. The satanic panic of the 1980s did not emerge from evidence. It emerged from fear, specifically the fear that secular modern society had created vulnerabilities that dark forces were exploiting, targeting children, corrupting innocents, operating in the shadows. The narrative had an almost religious structure. There was evil, there was innocence under attack, there were hidden perpetrators, and there were brave truth-tellers trying to expose the darkness. Decades later, that narrative structure was still there, dormant, waiting. And when Jeffrey Epstein, a man who demonstrably had abused children, who demonstrably had connections to powerful people, who demonstrably had died under suspicious circumstances in a federal detention facility, came along, that narrative structure found its perfect vessel. The specific satanic elements that attached to Epstein did not come from evidence. They came from the template. The temple on Little St. James looked, to people already primed with the satanic panic narrative template, like exactly what a satanic ritual space should look like. The documented presence of powerful men around Epstein's operation looked, to people already primed with a secret cabal template, like exactly what a secret cabal looks like. The suspicious circumstances of his death looked, to people already primed with a cover-up template, like exactly what a cover-up looks like. And then QAnon arrived, and everything got worse. In October 2017, on the image board 4chan, a user calling himself Q began posting. The post claimed to come from a high-ranking government official with top-secret clearance, someone inside the deep state who was using the anonymous forum to reveal the truth about a world-spanning satanic pedophile network that controlled governments, media, and financial institutions. The post used cryptic language QAnon referred to as drops that were deliberately vague enough to be interpreted in almost any direction while still sounding authoritative and insiderish. Over the following months and years, Q's audience grew. The post migrated from 4chan to 8chan to 8kun. Networks of interpreters and decoders emerged. Thousands of people who spent hours parsing Q's cryptic messages and constructing elaborate theories from them. YouTube channels devoted to QAnon content accumulated millions of subscribers. Facebook groups with hundreds of thousands of members formed and spread the content across mainstream platforms. Prominent political figures, including members of Congress, publicly expressed openness to or support for QAnon theories. The central claim of QAnon was, and remains this, that a global cabal of satanic pedophile elites, including most prominent Democratic politicians, Hollywood celebrities, and global financiers, were running a child trafficking operation, abusing children, and harvesting their blood for a compound called adrenochrome that prolonged the cabal's lives and gave them supernatural power. Donald Trump, in the QAnon mythology, was the one figure fighting against this cabal. The arrests of the guilty were always coming, always just around the corner. The Great Awakening was imminent. When Jeffrey Epstein was arrested in 2019, QAnon exploded. Here, at last, was a real, documented case of elite child trafficking, exactly what Q had been describing. Epstein's arrest was taken as confirmation of everything Q had said. His death, especially given its suspicious circumstances, was taken as evidence that the cabal had silenced him before he could testify. The non-prosecution agreement from 2008 was evidence of deep state protection. Ghislaine Maxwell's connections to the British establishment and her father's intelligence ties were evidence of the global reach of the cabal. The entire documented real Epstein case was absorbed wholesale into the QAnon mythology, and in the process, something important was lost: the distinction between what was documented and what was invented. Real facts about Epstein were mixed with invented ones. The real documented victims were mixed with fictional ones invented by QAnon creators to add narrative detail. The real names in court documents were mixed with the names of innocent people who had no connection to Epstein, but who fit the ideological profile of Q's enemies. A real and genuine child trafficking case was transformed into a supernatural mythology that was almost impossible to disentangle from the documented facts without significant effort and significant willingness to look at evidence carefully and critically, because this is the most important thing. The QAnon version of the Epstein story focused almost entirely on a small group of political figures, predominantly Democrats and Hollywood liberals, while functionally ignoring or minimizing the documented involvement of others, primarily on the political right, including figures far closer to Cannon's ideological orbit. This was not accidental. The Satanic conspiracy theory of Jeffrey Epstein was, in significant part, a politically weaponized distortion of a real story, one designed to direct anger and suspicion in specific directions while deflecting it from others. That is the machine. That is how it was built. And it was built on the back of real victims whose real suffering was being used as a narrative prop. We need to talk about adrenochrome because of all the specific claims embedded in the Satanic Epstein conspiracy theory. This one is both the most widely believed and the most thoroughly debunked, and the distance between those two facts is one of the most alarming measures of how far from reality the mythology has traveled. The claim, in its fully developed form, goes like this. Adrenochrome is a compound produced in the human body under conditions of extreme fear and stress. It is harvested from living children. Specifically, the theory claims children who are tortured and terrified to maximize adrenochrome production in their blood. This adrenochrome is then consumed by members of the global satanic cabal, the Hollywood elites, the politicians, the financiers, as a kind of superdrug that extends their lives, provides euphoric highs, and grants them access to supernatural states of consciousness. The blood-red under-eye circles that many celebrities show on red carpets, proof they're adrenochrome junkies. The bags under a politician's eyes after a long campaign, evidence of withdrawal. Every minor physical oddity on the face of a prominent person became, in the conspiracy communities, a sign of adrenochrome addiction. This theory has a long history, and tracing it reveals exactly how conspiracy mythology is constructed. Adrenochrome is real. Let's start there. It is a chemical compound that forms when adrenaline, the hormone epinephrine, is oxidized. It was studied in the 1950s, particularly by the psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond and his colleague Abram Hoffer, who theorized it might play a role in schizophrenia. This research was largely inconclusive and has not been significantly developed since. Adrenochrome can be synthetically produced in a laboratory. It is not a controlled substance. It does not produce the effects attributed to it by the conspiracy theories. It is not a recreational drug. There is no documented use of it as a drug in the medical literature. It entered popular culture in 1971 through Hunter S. Thompson's novel Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, where the character Dr. Gonzo claims to have obtained adrenochrome from a living donor, the adrenal gland of a living human body, he says. Thompson intended this as a dark satirical joke. He even acknowledged later that the effects described in the book were entirely fictional. But that passage, read without its satirical context, read literally by people already primed to believe in blood harvesting, became the foundational text of the adrenochrome myth. From Thompson's satirical novel, the idea passed through various layers of internet culture, acquired new details with each retelling, and eventually emerged as a fully formed and deadly serious belief. By the time QAnon absorbed it, it had accumulated decades of fictional accretion and was treated as established fact. Here's the truth. There is no peer-reviewed evidence that adrenochrome causes euphoria in humans. There is no documented supply chain of human-derived adrenochrome. There is no evidence that it is harvested from children. There is no evidence that it is consumed by elites. Every single element of the adrenochrome conspiracy theory, from the basic chemistry to the supposed trafficking mechanism, is either factually wrong or completely invented. But here's why this matters beyond just being wrong. The adrenochrome myth does active harm. It implies that every child trafficking operation, including the very real documented Epstein operation, exists primarily to harvest blood for a supernatural drug. This framing accomplishes something very specific. It moves the motivation for child abuse from where it actually lives, in the documented psychology of predators, in the operation of power and privilege and exploitation, into the realm of the supernatural and the metaphysical. And when you do that, you make it much harder to prosecute real cases, because real juries do not vote to convict on the basis of supernatural blood harvesting theories. Real prosecutors cannot use them. Real lawyers cannot cross-examine them. The adrenochrome myth is not just wrong. It is actively harmful to real victims of real trafficking, and its spread, turbocharged by social media and QAnon, has been one of the most damaging developments in public understanding of child exploitation in a generation. Let's go underground, literally, because one of the most persistent and most specifically detailed elements of the Epstein satanic mythology involves tunnels. Underground tunnels, networks of them, beneath Little St. James, beneath the Manhattan Mansion, beneath properties across the globe. The tunnels in the mythology are where the children were kept, where the rituals took place, where the evidence was hidden, where the truth would be found if only someone would dig. The tunnel mythology didn't start with Epstein. It goes all the way back to the McMartin preschool case, where parents and investigators were convinced that underground tunnels existed beneath the school and were used for ritual abuse. Archaeologists were brought in. They found nothing. The Satanic Panic's tunnel mythology is one of the most thoroughly debunked specific claims in the history of moral panic research. But debunked myths don't die. They migrate. They find new hosts. And when the Epstein story emerged, the tunnel mythology had a perfect new home. For Little St. James specifically, here is what is actually documented. The island has underground utility infrastructure, service tunnels that house electrical systems, plumbing, communications cables. These are visible in construction documents. Workers who built them have been interviewed. They describe what they are: utilities, the kind of infrastructure that exists on any large private property. The conspiracy theory took these documented utility tunnels and reframed them as the secret chambers of satanic child trafficking operation. For the Manhattan Mansion, the 9-story townhouse at 9 East 71st Street, the situation is similar. The mansion is a large, old building with the kind of basement and sub-basement infrastructure common to 19th century New York construction. There is no documented evidence of secret tunnels beyond what would be expected in a building of that age and size. Epstein used the building as his residence and as the base of his financial operation. Survivors have described what happened there in significant detail. What they describe is horrifying. What they describe does not include satanic tunnels. One of the most viral pieces of tunnel mythology content was a video that circulated widely in 2019 and 2020, purporting to show a video of children being trafficked through tunnels on Epstein's Island. The video was debunked within days of going viral by multiple fact-checking organizations and journalists. It was footage from an entirely different location, repurposed with false narration. But the debunking never traveled as far as the original claim. It never does. Why are tunnels so compelling to the human imagination in these contexts? Because tunnels are a perfect metaphor for what the conspiracy theory is fundamentally about: hidden things, things beneath the surface, a visible, mundane world above, and a secret, dark, ritual world below. The tunnel mythology externalizes and literalizes the emotional truth that there is something hidden, something not being told, something under the surface of events. The emotional truth is real. There absolutely were things being hidden about Epstein's operation. There absolutely were institutional failures and cover-ups. But the emotional truth does not justify inventing physical evidence. Real tunnels can be found. Real tunnels can be photographed. Real tunnels can be entered and documented. The Epstein tunnel mythology has never produced a photograph, a witness account, or a physical measurement of a non-utility tunnel anywhere, because the tunnels don't exist. The secrecy that spawned the mythology was real, but the tunnels were a story. Before we continue dismantling the satanic mythology specifically around Epstein, we need to talk about Bohemian Grove, because it represents one of the most important case studies in how real and genuinely strange things get incorporated into conspiracy mythologies in ways that distort rather than illuminate. Bohemian Grove is real. Let's start with that. It is a private retreat located in Monte Rio, California, in a redwood grove owned by the Bohemian Club, an elite private club founded in San Francisco in 1872. Every July, for approximately 2 weeks, the Bohemian Grove hosts a gathering of some of the most powerful men in America. We're talking former presidents, sitting politicians, business titans, media executives, military brass, academics. The guest list over the decades has included Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Henry Kissinger, and scores of others. The gathering is secret in the sense that it is private. Members do not publicize what happens there, and press access has historically been denied or severely restricted. Journalists, including John Ronson, have infiltrated the event and written about it. What they described was genuinely strange, but not in the supernatural direction. Powerful men drinking heavily. Performances and theatrical productions staged in the woods. And most famously, a ceremony called a cremation of care, held on the first night of the gathering, in which an effigy is burned before a large stone owl statue, an owl known as Moloch, which serves as the symbolic deity of the grove. The cremation of care ceremony was designed by its founders in the 19th century as a symbolic letting go of worldly cares, the burdens of commerce and power, for the duration of the retreat. The owl is the symbol of the Bohemian Club, representing wisdom. The ceremony is theatrical, ritualistic in the stagecraft sense, and is very deliberately evocative of ancient pagan symbolism that was aesthetic choice, not spiritual belief. Former participants who have spoken about it describe it as theatrical, nostalgic, somewhat absurd. Is it strange that some of the most powerful men in the world gather in the woods once a year for a secret retreat involving theatrical rituals? Yes, absolutely. Is it the right of the public to be concerned about the lack of transparency around what powerful people discuss and decide when they're gathered away from public view? Yes, absolutely. Is there documented evidence that Bohemian Grove is a satanic child sacrifice operation? No, none whatsoever. The Bohemian Grove owl became, in the conspiracy mythology, connected to the owl statues on Little St. James. Both owls, the theory held, represented Moloch, and therefore both locations were nodes in the same ancient satanic network. The leap required to go from "these are decorative owl statues used in different contexts by different people for different reasons" to "these are the same satanic symbol connecting two nodes of a global blood cult" is so enormous that you would need a running start from Mars to make it. Real things, the Bohemian Grove gathering, the owl symbolism, the genuine opacity around what is discussed at these gatherings, were real. Real concern about elite accountability was real, but the connection to Epstein was invented. The satanic interpretation of the owl symbolism was invented. The blood sacrifice mythology was invented. And every invented element added to the structure made it harder to address the real elements clearly. This section requires the most care of any in this video, because we are going to talk about the actual people named in actual legal documents related to the Epstein case. Not rumor, not theory. Documents, court filings, deposition transcripts, legal declarations, and the official findings of judicial proceedings. The most significant unsealing of documents in the Epstein case occurred in January 2024, when a federal judge ordered the release of documents from the Giuffre versus Maxwell civil case. The documents were extensive. Hundreds of pages of deposition testimony, correspondence, and evidence submitted during the lawsuit. The Internet, predictably, treated the release as if every name in every document was a confirmed child abuser. This is not what the documents say. Here is what the documents actually contain and what they actually establish. Prince Andrew, Duke of York. Virginia Giuffre stated in a sworn deposition that she was directed by Epstein to have sex with Prince Andrew when she was 17. She described this occurring at Ghislaine Maxwell's London home. Prince Andrew denied the allegations. He was never charged. In 2022, he reached a settlement with Virginia Giuffre in her civil suit against him. The terms were not fully disclosed, but he reportedly made a substantial payment. He has stepped back from royal duties. The settlement is not an admission of guilt, but it is, combined with Giuffre's sworn testimony, significant evidence of conduct that is, at the very minimum, deeply troubling. Alan Dershowitz. Giuffre named Dershowitz in her lawsuit as one of the individuals she was trafficked to. Dershowitz vehemently denied this and filed counterclaims. The litigation between Giuffre and Dershowitz was highly contentious, involving mutual allegations. In 2023, Giuffre filed a retraction with the court stating that she may have been mistaken in naming Dershowitz specifically, noting she had made the statement when she was too young to remember correctly. Dershowitz has pointed to this retraction as exoneration. The situation remains legally and evidentially complex. Bill Clinton. Clinton's name appears in flight logs for Epstein's private jet, confirming he flew on it on multiple documented occasions. Clinton has acknowledged knowing Epstein and flying on his jet. He has denied ever visiting Little St. James or Epstein's other properties. He has never been accused of misconduct by any survivor in a sworn legal document. His presence in the conspiracy mythology has been amplified far beyond what the documentary evidence supports. Donald Trump also appears in flight logs, also has documented social history with Epstein, also quoted calling him a terrific guy with a preference for younger women. Trump claimed in 2019 that he had fallen out with Epstein years ago and specifically banned him from his Mar-a-Lago property. Reporting has confirmed this occurred following a complaint about Epstein's behavior toward a guest daughter. Trump has not been charged or credibly accused in the survivor's sworn testimony of participating in Epstein's abuse. The lesson from all of this is not that powerful people are innocent. Several of them have documented concerning connections. Several of them have faced serious, credible accusations. Some of them reached settlements. But the conspiracy theories treat the mere appearance of a name in any document as equivalent to a conviction for child sacrifice. That is not how evidence works. That is not how justice works. And insisting that it does makes the people making that argument sound like conspiracy theorists, which then makes everyone who questions power for good reason sound the same way. We have to be able to say, some of these people may have done terrible things, and we don't have enough evidence to say exactly what, and the process of determining that requires careful, evidence-based investigation, not mythology. Let's talk about the intelligence angle, because this is where conspiracy theories and the genuine open questions are most closely intertwined, and therefore where the most careful attention is required. There are documented connections between Jeffrey Epstein and the world of intelligence. They are real. They are concerning. And they deserve to be taken seriously in a way that does not turn them into the foundation for an unfounded superstructure of theory. Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, had documented connections to Israeli intelligence. Multiple biographies of Robert Maxwell, including those by respected journalists, describe him as having worked with Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, in various capacities during the Cold War. After Robert Maxwell's mysterious death, there were published accounts from former Mossad officials who claimed to have worked with him. Whether Robert Maxwell was a full Mossad asset, an occasional informant, or simply a well-connected man with intelligence relationships, the documented record suggests real connections. Ghislaine Maxwell has denied being an intelligence operative. The claim that she is or was a Mossad agent working through Epstein to run a blackmail operation against global elites is a theory with some documented circumstantial support and a lot of documented imagination. What the available evidence cannot establish is whether Maxwell was a directed intelligence asset or simply a well-connected daughter of a man with intelligence relationships. The reported statement by former U.S. Attorney Alex Acosta that he was told Epstein belonged to intelligence is, if accurate, significant, but it is a reported statement, not a documented one, and Acosta has not publicly confirmed or expanded on it in any usable way. What the conspiracy theories do with this documented kernel is staggering. The real intelligence connections, which might mean Epstein had some protected status with some intelligence agency for reasons related to information gathering or blackmail, get transformed into a narrative where Epstein was running a satanic ritual network on behalf of a Luciferian globalist cabal that itself controls intelligence agencies across multiple countries. The two things are not the same. A real intelligence connection, if it existed, would most plausibly mean something mundane and sinister. That Epstein was used as an intelligence asset in the collection of compromising information about powerful people, which was then used as leverage by whichever intelligence service was running him. This is a real intelligence tradecraft practice. It is called a honey trap operation. It is morally reprehensible. It would help explain the extraordinary protection Epstein seemed to enjoy. It would potentially implicate specific intelligence agencies in complicity with his abuse of children. That story, real, documented, human, implicating real institutions, is both more plausible and more actionable than the satanic cult version. And it is being buried under the satanic cult version. Because a blackmail operation run by a state intelligence agency is something a journalist can investigate. It is something a prosecutor can potentially prosecute. It is something Congress can potentially hold hearings on. A satanic cult with supernatural powers is none of those things. The intelligence angle deserves serious, evidence-based investigation. The satanic cult angle deserves what it has always deserved: retirement. This section is the most important, more important than any of the dramatic revelations, more important than any of the conspiracy debunking, more important than any of the power analysis, because every section of this video has been building toward this. The mythology doesn't just fail the truth, it actively betrays the victims. And the victims are the only thing in the story that actually matters. Let's talk about the real survivors, not as names in a case file, or as narrative props in a YouTube script, or as martyrs in mythology. As human beings who were children when someone who was supposed to be safe, who was presented to them as a benefactor, as an opportunity, as a way out of difficult circumstances, used that presentation to violate and exploit them. Virginia Roberts Giuffre was first recruited at the age of 14 or 15, working at Mar-a-Lago as a spa attendant. Ghislaine Maxwell approached her. Over the following years, she describes being trafficked to powerful men, being abused repeatedly, and being made to feel that she had no recourse, that the men she was trafficked to were too powerful to report, that no one would believe her, that she was somehow complicit in what had been done to her. She has told her story in depositions in civil suits and in public interviews with extraordinary courage and specificity. She won a settlement from the Giuffre estate and has continued to advocate for survivors. Sarah Ransom described being recruited in her mid-20s, flown to Little St. James, and abused repeatedly. She has described being threatened, being told that Epstein's connections made resistance futile, and spending years afterward unable to process what had happened to her or find pathways to justice. Dozens of other women, the public knows some of their names, many remain anonymous, have filed complaints, testified in depositions, and in many cases watched as those complaints were filed away, settled cheaply, or simply ignored by institutional systems that were not designed to believe them. These women, and there are hundreds of them, went through something real, something documented, something that happened in ordinary rooms and expensive properties, facilitated not by supernatural evil but by ordinary human cruelty, ordinary institutional failure, and extraordinary wealth. They did not need a satanic narrative to validate their suffering. Their suffering is valid. Their testimony is credible. The evidence supporting their accounts is overwhelming. And the satanic conspiracy mythology, the tunnels, the blood rituals, the adrenochrome, the interdimensional beings, does catastrophic harm to these survivors. Here's how. First, it creates the impression that the real abuse is somehow less terrible than the invented abuse. It implies that if there were no satanic rituals, if it was just rape and trafficking, then somehow the story doesn't rise to the level of the mythology. That framing is a violence to survivors. What was done to them was one of the worst things that can be done to a human being. It does not need supernatural embellishment to be taken seriously. Second, the mythology discredits survivors' actual testimonies by association. When real survivors appear in courtrooms or in media, they risk being lumped in with the QAnon mythology, being treated as participants in a vast paranoid fantasy rather than witnesses to documented crimes. Defense attorneys have used this. When a survivor's account is associated in the public mind with adrenochrome theories and underground temples, her credibility is damaged even when her testimony is entirely grounded in documented reality. Third, the mythology diverts resources and attention from actual investigative work. Journalists and prosecutors who could be pursuing documented leads the intelligence connection, the full scope of the trafficking network, the co-conspirators who are not prosecuted, are instead spending time addressing, debunking, or navigating around mythology that has contaminated the information environment. The survivors of Jeffrey Epstein's crimes deserve the truth, the whole truth, documented and verified. They deserve justice pursued through real evidence and real legal process. They deserve the world's anger, undiluted by mythology, directed clearly and accurately at the people and institutions that failed them. The mythology gives them none of that. One of the most infuriating threads in the entire Epstein story is the question of who knew what, when, and why they didn't report it. Because journalists knew, editors knew, television executives knew, and for years, decades in some cases, the story didn't run. And understanding why requires looking at the media ecosystem with the same unflinching honesty that we bring to looking at the legal system, the financial system, and the social network that protected Epstein. The most famous case of suppressed journalism involves ABC News reporter Amy Robach, who was caught in a hot mic recording in 2019, the year of Epstein's arrest, saying that she had the story on Epstein 3 years earlier. She had interviewed Virginia Giuffre, she said. She had names. She had documentation. And ABC News had killed the story. I had everything, Robach said. I tried for 3 years to get on the air. She alleged the network had been pressured. She implied the pressure came from the British royal family. Given Prince Andrew's involvement, ABC News denied the characterization and maintained the story wasn't ready for broadcast. Robach herself later walked back some of the specificity of her hot mic comments in official statements. But the broader point, that a major news organization had a significant piece of the Epstein story years before it finally broke and chose not to run it, was not disputed. The Miami Herald's Julie Brown is a journalist who finally cracked the story open in 2018, publishing a comprehensive investigation into Epstein's crimes and the 2008 plea deal that ran under the headline, How a Future Trump Cabinet Member Gave a Serial Sex Abuser the Deal of a Lifetime. Brown's reporting was the immediate catalyst for federal reinvestigation of Epstein that led to his 2019 arrest. Her work was meticulous, evidence-based, and devastating. Exactly the kind of journalism that the satanic conspiracy theories cannot replicate or replace. Brown's success makes the earlier silence more damning. If a reporter at a regional newspaper could put together a comprehensive investigation with the right commitment and institutional support, why couldn't the larger networks and outlets that had access to even more resources? The answer is uncomfortable and human. Social relationships, access journalism, the desire not to antagonize powerful sources, the legal risk of publishing accusations against wealthy, litigious men, the simple, shameful preference for not making things difficult, the conspiracy theories. Ironically, given how they delegitimize themselves, often claim that the media's silence was evidence of deep state control. In reality, the silence had much more prosaic and much more common causes. The ordinary dynamics of institutional media in an era when access to power was treated as a currency and burning powerful bridges was treated as an unacceptable risk. Not a satanic conspiracy, just a system that didn't work the way it was supposed to. There's a lesson here for what healthy journalism can and cannot do. Julie Brown's investigation changed the course of the story. Evidence-based, source-protected, methodically documented journalism worked. The QAnon mythology did not break the story. The legal documentation did not emerge from conspiracy forums. The people who held Epstein accountable, such as it was, were people doing real work with real sources and real evidence. This might be the most important section for understanding not just the Epstein conspiracy mythology, but the entire phenomenon of conspiracy thinking in a digital age. Because the people who believe the satanic Epstein mythology are not all stupid. They are not all bad. They are not all acting in bad faith. Many of them are people who are genuinely outraged by genuine injustice, who have a genuinely healthy distrust of institutional authority, and who are looking for a framework that explains why terrible things keep happening to innocent people and why the powerful keep escaping accountability. In other words, many conspiracy believers start from a place of moral clarity, and that's what makes the slide into mythology so insidious. Let's follow the psychology. A person encounters, for the first time, the documented fact of the Epstein case. The crimes are real and horrible. The 2008 plea deal is real and outrageous. The death in federal custody is real and suspicious. This person feels correctly that something is deeply wrong. The existing institutions that were supposed to prevent this didn't. The media that was supposed to expose it didn't. The legal system that was supposed to prosecute it offered a sweetheart deal. All of this is real. All of this is legitimate. Now that person is online, searching, looking for more information, and the internet's recommendation algorithms, which are optimized not for truth, but for engagement, begin offering them content that goes further, that adds detail, that escalates the outrage. A YouTube video about the island, a Reddit thread about the tunnels, a QAnon drop that claims to contain inside knowledge. Each piece of content feels like it's filling in gaps, connecting dots, bringing the hidden truth to light. Psychologists have a term for this: apophenia, the tendency of the human mind to perceive meaningful patterns in unrelated things. It is the same cognitive mechanism that lets us see faces in clouds or shapes in random data. When you are emotionally primed, when you're already outraged, already convinced that there's a cover-up, already predisposed to believe that hidden forces are at work, apophenia goes into overdrive. Connections that are not connections start to look compelling. Evidence that is not evidence starts to feel persuasive. And then there is the social dimension. Conspiracy communities are, paradoxically, among the most intensely social spaces on the internet. The shared project of researching and red-pilling creates bonds. The shared language of mythology creates identity. The sense of being part of a community of truth seekers who see what others are too asleep or too corrupted to see. That sense is genuinely rewarding. Leaving the community means giving up the identity, the bonds, the sense of purpose. This is not a failure of intelligence. Studies consistently show that education level and intelligence do not strongly protect against conspiracy belief. In fact, there is some evidence that higher intelligence makes people better at rationalizing their pre-existing beliefs, a phenomenon called motivated reasoning. The most effective protection against conspiracy belief is not IQ. It is what psychologists call actively open-minded thinking, the habit of deliberately seeking out evidence that challenges your existing beliefs, of taking seriously the possibility that you are wrong, of being willing to follow evidence where it actually leads rather than where you want it to go. The satanic Epstein mythology preys on good impulses, the impulse toward justice, the impulse toward accountability, the impulse to believe survivors, the impulse to distrust power, and it weaponizes those impulses, redirecting them into a mythology that serves power rather than challenging it. That is the deepest irony of the whole thing. The people who believe the conspiracy theories most fervently are often the people most motivated to challenge the elite. And they are being played by a narrative that protects the elite far more effectively than transparency and documented evidence would. We spent a lot of time in this video talking about what didn't happen and what isn't true. Let's spend this section talking about what did happen, what did work, and most importantly, what still hasn't been resolved. What happened? Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted. She sits in federal prison with a 20-year sentence. This is, by the standards of this case's history, a significant outcome. The woman who was Epstein's most active facilitator, his primary recruiter of victims, his essential operational partner. She was found guilty by a federal jury in December 2021 after a trial that included devastating testimony from survivors. The conviction was real. The sentence was real. The 2008 plea deal was publicly examined, condemned, and led directly to the downfall of Alex Acosta's career. When Acosta was named Labor Secretary in the Trump administration, the reporting on his role in the Epstein deal forced his resignation. The non-prosecution agreement was ruled to have violated the Crime Victims' Rights Act. This is not nothing. The accountability was partial and long delayed, but it was real. Multiple civil settlements have been reached. Jeffrey Epstein's estate, worth an estimated $500 million at the time of his death, has been used to fund a victims' compensation fund, which has paid out to hundreds of claimants. The financial compensation is not justice, but it is acknowledgement. The payouts from the fund required claimants to document their abuse in specific detail, creating a body of evidence about what happened that is both horrifying and necessary. What hasn't happened? The co-conspirators who were given immunity in the 2008 non-prosecution agreement have never been identified publicly or charged. The scope of the blackmail operation, if it was a blackmail operation, has never been fully investigated or publicly documented. The specific individuals who are credibly alleged by survivors to have participated in abuse have in most cases not faced charges. The institutional failures that allowed Epstein to operate for decades, the regulatory bodies, the intelligence agencies, the media organizations that suppress stories, have not been meaningfully examined or held accountable. And critically, the fully sealed evidence, the contents of Epstein's safes, the documents seized from his properties at the time of his 2019 arrest, the full scope of his financial records remains only partially public. Investigators have reportedly found evidence of recordings, video and audio made at Epstein's properties. What those recordings contain and who they contain has not been publicly established. This is where the legitimate outrage should live, not in invented tunnels, not in invented satanic rituals. In the real, documented, partially unresolved questions about who benefited from the abuse, who facilitated it, who knew about it and chose silence, and what it will take to bring those individuals to some form of accountability. The fight for justice for Epstein survivors is ongoing. It is a fight being waged by real lawyers, real journalists, and real advocates doing real documented work. That work is slow. It is frustrating. It does not produce the dramatic revelations that conspiracy theories promise. But it is the only work that has ever actually produced results. A conviction, a legal ruling, financial restitution, a resignation. Results are what survivors deserve, not mythology. Here is something that nobody in the satanic conspiracy theory world wants to acknowledge, because it is both more disturbing and less satisfying than mythology. The real Epstein story does not require evil to be supernatural. It does not require a secret cabal with ancient rituals and occult powers. It does not require adrenochrome or interdimensional beings or blood sacrifice. What it requires, what it reveals, is something far more unsettling, because it is something we all have to live with every day. The real Epstein story reveals what ordinary evil looks like when it has unlimited resources. Jeffrey Epstein was not a supernatural being. He was a human predator of extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary social skill. He understood, with clinical precision, how power works in human social hierarchies. He understood that wealth buys access, that access buys connection, and that connection creates protection. He understood that the very human desire not to ask uncomfortable questions of wealthy, impressive, well-connected people would serve as an essentially impenetrable shield. He understood that institutions, legal, financial, social, are populated by human beings with human weaknesses. Ambition, ego, self-interest, the desire for proximity to power and glamour. He exploited all of it systematically, over decades, not through supernatural means, but through very ordinary human psychology. And the people who facilitated him, whether knowingly or unknowingly, whether as active participants or as passive silencers, were not hooded figures in underground rituals. They were lawyers who crafted favorable plea deals. They were government officials who accepted the reasoning that the man was too well connected to prosecute fully. They were journalists who decided the story wasn't worth the legal risk and the burnt bridges. They were wealthy patrons who saw something uncomfortable at a party and chose not to see it. They were friends who asked no questions because the money was impressive and the connections were valuable. This is what the face of evil looks like in the real world. It doesn't wear a robe. It wears a suit. It sits in corner offices and on corporate boards and in political offices. It has a Rolodex and a private jet and a Manhattan townhouse. It uses institutions not for supernatural rituals, but for the very ordinary mechanisms of protection that wealth provides. And it preys on the most vulnerable people, the people with the least access to those same institutions of protection, because they're the easiest to silence, the easiest to disbelieve, the easiest to make disappear into a legal system that was not designed with their interests in mind. That is the truth. It is not dramatic in the way that satanic rituals are dramatic. It does not have the cinematic urchin of mythology about blood and power and ancient darkness. But it is the truth that connects the Epstein case to every other case of elite abuse of power, to every financial scandal where the wealthy walked away clean, to every political corruption where accountability was bought off, to every institutional failure where protecting the institution mattered more than protecting the victims. The satanic mythology, by making the evil supernatural, actually lets the ordinary evil off the hook. If Epstein was a supernatural satanic figure, then the lawyers who made his plea deal were duped by occult forces, not corrupted by ordinary self-interest. If Epstein was a blood cult priest, then the politicians who attended his parties were entrapped by supernatural conspiracy, not simply exercising poor judgment in pursuit of social connection. The mythology, paradoxically, excuses the ordinary human failures. They're the actual story. The real lesson of Jeffrey Epstein, the lesson that could actually produce change, that could actually produce better legal systems, better media accountability, better institutional protection for vulnerable people, is not that we need to identify and defeat a satanic cabal. It is that we need to examine, honestly and without flinching, the very ordinary ways that power and money and connection create impunity, the very ordinary ways that institutions fail the people they're supposed to protect, the very ordinary ways that we all, in our small daily choices, contribute to or resist those failures. That lesson is available to us. It is documented. It is provable. It is actionable. The mythology buries it under a pile of invented horror that feels more dramatic but produces nothing. Nothing for the survivors, nothing for the truth, nothing for the future. We've come a long way, through the life of a predator, through the documented crimes and the real survivors, through the institutional failures and the political connections, through the suspicious death and the legitimate unanswered questions, through the birth and spread of the satanic mythology, the tunnels and the temples, and the adrenochrome, and the QAnon pipeline that turbocharge it all, through the psychology of belief and the specific ways mythology harms real victims. Now I want to make a closing argument, not for any political side, not for any institution, for the truth, just the truth, in all its uncomfortable, infuriating, undramatic reality. The truth is this: Jeffrey Epstein was a child sex trafficker. He abused hundreds of young girls and women over multiple decades. He was enabled by extraordinary wealth, extraordinary social connections, and an institutional ecosystem, legal, financial, political, journalistic, that failed catastrophically to stop him. He died under genuinely suspicious circumstances in federal custody, and we still do not know with certainty whether he killed himself or was killed. The people who facilitated his crimes have not been fully identified or held accountable. The blackmail operation he may have been running, and the intelligence connections that may have protected it, has not been fully investigated. Real injustices remain. Real questions remain. Real accountability has not been achieved. That truth, the full documented, infuriating truth, is the foundation of everything that matters about this case. It is the foundation of what the survivors deserve. It is the foundation of the systemic reforms that could prevent the next Jeffrey Epstein. It is the foundation of any real justice. The mythology, the satanic rituals, the underground temples, the adrenochrome blood harvesting, the interdimensional cabal is not part of that truth. It is a parasite on that truth. It takes the emotional energy that real outrage generates and channels it into invented directions. It names fictional perpetrators and fictional crimes in the same breath as real ones. It makes the real story sound insane by association. It gives the guilty a shield made of the world's eye rolls. It betrays the survivors by reducing their real trauma to a narrative prop in someone else's mythology. And here's the thing about mythology. It is never actually about what it claims to be about. The satanic panic of the 1980s was not really about Satanists abusing children in daycares, because there weren't any. It was about the cultural anxieties of an era, about changing gender roles, about the increasing participation of women in the workforce, about evolving sexual norms, about the perceived breakdown of traditional religious authority. The mythology processed those anxieties in a form that was dramatic and blaming and specifically directable at a particular enemy. The QAnon version of the satanic Epstein mythology is not really about Jeffrey Epstein's victims, because if it were, it would have been far more useful to them. It is about the political anxieties of a specific moment, about the distrust of globalization and elite institutions, about the perceived persecution of traditional values, about the rage of communities that feel left behind and lied to, about the specific political project of directing that rage in particular directions against particular enemies. The mythology processes those real anxieties into a form that is dramatic and blaming and specifically directable. But it does not serve the anxieties. It exploits them. The real victims of Jeffrey Epstein are not served by adrenochrome theories. They are served by patient, documented, evidence-based legal advocacy, by journalism that follows specific evidence to specific conclusions, by institutional reform that makes it harder for wealth to purchase immunity, by a cultural shift in which the credible testimony of survivors is taken seriously, investigated rigorously, and acted upon by institutions of justice. Those things are harder than mythology. They are slower. They don't produce the dopamine rush of a viral theory that seems to explain everything. They require us to sit with uncertainty, to say we don't know exactly what happened yet, rather than we know everything and here's the secret truth. They require us to reserve our accusations for people we can actually accuse with evidence, and to withhold them from people we merely suspect or find politically convenient to blame. But they're the only things that have ever actually worked. Julie Brown's journalism worked. The federal prosecution in SDNY worked. Even though it was cut short, Giuffre's civil suit worked, producing evidence and accountability. The legal advocacy of survivors and their attorneys worked, producing the unsealing of documents and conviction of Maxwell. The mythology has never worked. It has never produced a conviction. It has never identified a perpetrator. It has never verified a piece of evidence. It has never gotten a survivor justice. It has occasionally gotten innocent people harassed, threatened, and subjected to real-world violence, as happened when followers of QAnon targeted individuals they had incorrectly identified as part of the Satanic cabal. There's one more thing I want to say, and it's the hardest thing, because it requires each of us to do something genuinely difficult. If you have shared conspiracy theory content about Jeffrey Epstein, if you've spread the adrenochrome theory or the Satanic Temple theory or the blood harvest mythology, I am not asking you to feel ashamed. The instinct that led you there was, in most cases, a good one. You were outraged by a real injustice. You wanted to understand it. You wanted the guilty to be named. You wanted the victims to be believed. Those are good instincts. But those instincts were exploited. You were given a story that used real outrage as fuel to drive you somewhere that the truth was not. And now the hard thing, the genuinely difficult thing, is to back up, to look at the documented evidence, to sit with a legitimate uncertainty rather than filling it with comfortable mythology, to redirect the outrage at the real failures, the real perpetrators, the real institutional collapses that made all of this possible. That work is not glamorous. It does not go viral. It does not produce the thunderclap of revelation that a satanic conspiracy video produces. But it is the only thing that will mean something to a survivor who is sitting in a courtroom years from now, waiting to see if the world is finally ready to take her seriously, waiting to see if the truth, the real, documented human truth, is finally enough. It has to be enough. Because the victims need the truth more than they need our mythology. They need us to look clearly at what actually happened. They need us to name the people who actually did it with evidence, not with theory. They need us to demand accountability from real institutions through real legal and political pressure. They need us to care about them enough to do the hard, slow, unglamorous work of truth. Jeffrey Epstein was a monster, not a supernatural one, a human one, and that is worse than the mythology, not better, because it means that the forces that created him, protected him, and enabled him are still out there. They are ordinary. They are structural. They are changeable if we are willing to look at them clearly. The truth is always harder than the myth, but the truth is the only thing that can set anyone free. And now you know the difference. What you do with that That's on you.